The moment he walked into my sister Elena's wedding, I could tell he felt like he had made a terrible mistake. Everyone around us was dressed in silk, diamonds, and perfectly pressed suits, while he stood near the entrance in the only dark blue suit he owned, holding a small gift and wondering how long he could stay without being noticed. Then, I stepped out from behind a floral arrangement, looked directly into his eyes, and whispered something that made his heart stop. I told him all about what Elena had said. He had no idea what I meant. He assumed Elena had never talked about him outside the office. At least, that was what he believed. And before that night ended, he would discover that the woman he thought had only ever seen him as an employee had been quietly watching over his life for years. Before we continue, if you believe people deserve second chances, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, leave a comment, and subscribe to The Invisible Line. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories about kindness, courage, and second chances. His name is Daniel, and for 6 years he had worked as an assistant at a small financial firm where my sister, Elena Carter, was his boss. She was demanding, organized, and sometimes intimidating, but she was also fair. She never embarrassed employees in front of others, never took credit for someone else's work, and always seemed to notice when somebody was struggling. Still, Daniel kept his distance. He was raising his 12-year-old daughter, Sophie, alone, and every month felt like a puzzle he was barely managing to solve. After his wife passed away several years earlier, he had stopped expecting life to surprise him with anything good. His world had become simple: work, home, Sophie, bills, and sleep. He didn't have time for dreams. Then, Elena announced she was getting married. The office erupted with excitement. She invited everyone to her wedding, including Daniel. He almost refused because he couldn't afford an expensive gift or the kind of clothes people usually wore to such an event. But Sophie insisted he go. She helped him choose his old blue suit and wrapped a simple wooden jewelry box she had made at school as a wedding gift. She told him that sometimes showing up mattered more than bringing something expensive. So he came. The wedding was beautiful. The garden was filled with white flowers, soft lights, and rows of elegant chairs. He stayed toward the back, hoping to congratulate Elena quietly and leave before anyone noticed him. But just as he was about to turn away, I approached him. I studied his face for a moment before telling him that Elena had told me all about him. He nervously laughed and asked what she could possibly have said. I smiled sadly and told him Elena had described him as one of the strongest people she knew. He didn't know how to respond. Strong was not a word he had ever used for himself. He had felt exhausted for years. He had cried silently in the kitchen when bills piled up. He had sat beside Sophie at night pretending everything was fine when he wasn't sure how they would manage the following month. He had missed birthdays, celebrations, and opportunities because survival always came first. Strong people, he thought, didn't feel afraid all the time. Then I told him something that completely changed the way he saw my sister. I told him Elena had noticed everything. She knew he had once taken unpaid leave because Sophie was sick. She knew he had quietly turned down a promotion because the additional travel would have left Sophie alone too often. She knew that he regularly skipped lunch because he was saving money. Most importantly, she knew about the little wooden jewelry box Sophie had made, because apparently he had once mentioned it at work without realizing Elena had remembered. Then I reached into my purse and handed him a folded envelope. His name was written on it in Elena's handwriting. He opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a letter thanking him for being part of her life, not simply as an employee, but as someone whose perseverance had inspired her. She wrote that she had watched him choose responsibility when nobody was applauding, kindness when he was tired, and patience when life had given him every reason to become bitter. But there was more. Elena had learned that the company was restructuring, and his position was at risk. She had spent months fighting to create a new role for him, one that would allow him to work fewer late evenings while keeping his salary stable. She had also arranged a scholarship opportunity for Sophie through a community foundation she supported. She hadn't told him earlier because she didn't want him to feel indebted to her. He stood there, surrounded by hundreds of people, yet suddenly felt completely alone with his emotions. He had spent years believing nobody noticed how hard he was trying, and now he realized someone had noticed every single day. When Elena finally saw him, she walked over, still wearing her wedding dress. He thanked her, but she simply smiled and told him that he had already given her something more valuable than any wedding present, proof that good people could keep going even when life was unfair. She said she hoped he would stop measuring his worth by what he could provide and start remembering who he was beyond his responsibilities. A week later, he returned to work expecting nothing to change, but on his desk was an offer for the new position Elena had created. The hours were better, the responsibilities matched his experience, and for the first time in years, he could imagine having dinner with Sophie without checking the clock every 5 minutes. Months passed. Sophie received the scholarship and began talking excitedly about her future. Daniel started saving again, not just for emergencies, but for small joys. On weekends, he and Sophie visited parks, watched old movies, and sometimes bought ice cream without calculating whether they could afford it. One evening, Sophie asked him why he seemed happier. He told her that sometimes you spend so long believing you're invisible that you forget how powerful it feels when someone finally sees you. And that was the lesson he carried with him from Elena's wedding. Sometimes the person standing quietly in the corner is fighting a battle nobody knows about. Sometimes kindness is not a grand gesture. Sometimes it is remembering someone's struggle, opening a door, or simply telling them that their efforts matter. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who may need encouragement, and subscribe to The Invisible Line. You never know whose life might be changed by a story about hope. And before this story ends, I want you to leave one special comment. Someone sees my struggle. Write it if you've ever worked hard in silence, helped others without recognition, or simply needed someone to believe in you. Because sometimes the greatest gift isn't money, success, or applause. Sometimes it is discovering that while you thought nobody was watching, someone was quietly believing in you all along. Have you ever felt completely invisible while fighting your hardest battles, only to realize someone was watching over you all along? What would you have done if you were in Daniel's shoes standing in that garden? Share your stories in the comments below.